just for the record, please give us your full name. How do you want to be? James, Jim?
Jim. My name is James Timmins, Sr. My nickname is Jim.
And what's your profession? Like, what do you want us to put as a CG?
I'm in private equity, and I raise institutional capital in private equity.
Now that we're 20 years removed from what happened, you've had plenty of time to process. What goes through your mind?
Ooh. Lots of people were hurt. It was an interesting time. I remember when Enron started having problems in 2001. I had left 18 months before, and I realized that a lot of the problems financially that Enron was having, in my view, were a direct result of actions by senior management that I had been early on involved in, but I saw tremendous issues with, which led to my departure, again, a year and a half before the problems really started.
So let's go back and talk about your role at Enron. What did you do, and how did you discover what was happening?
I started in February of 1997, and I had a very unique job at Enron. I was a private equity guy, which means any business unit which wanted to access the traditional institutional community had to come through me. Institutional community is defined, in my opinion, as pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, foundations, and endowments. So any business unit worldwide which wanted to access that market had to come through me. So we had one voice out in the public in the institutional market. That was me. So I saw a lot of opportunities that Enron was pursuing. I traveled a lot to South America, traveled a lot to Europe, of course a lot around North America. And the third year I was at Enron, I was asked by the CFO to create a structure for third-party equity to come in and make investments alongside Enron. The way I structured it would require certain corporate governance to avoid self-dealing, related party transactions, and those kinds of things that tend to get you in a lot of trouble. As it turns out, my suggestions were not taken, and the CFO chose to actually step in to be the general partner of this private equity fund himself, against my suggestions and against my advice. And I figured that was going to lead to a lot of issues down the road. I didn't know when, but I figured it would. So I went to the first 6 or 8 meetings when this product was out in the market. They had hired Merrill Lynch to be their placement agent, but I was coordinating all the meetings with the various institutional prospects. And after about 6 or 8 meetings, I decided that it wasn't for me, that I saw too much potential fraud, self-dealing, self-enrichment at the expense of Enron shareholders. So I decided that I would quit. And that was late 1999 when I made that decision. I went into the CFO's office got on his calendar in early 2000, and it was a very short conversation that I didn't agree with what was being done, and I wanted to move on. His response was, "I think you're wrong. I think it's good for Enron. It's good for the shareholders. It's good for everybody." I said I respectfully disagree, and I walked in very intimidated to this office with 2-story ceilings, but I walked out very empowered, because I really, I had to tell him what I thought of what was being done, because there was a lot of flack, there was a lot of noise around it, and there was a lot of potential for fraud.
It must have been really difficult, because at the time when people talked about Enron, as far as markets, I mean, it was, when you look at those graphs and those charts, they were doing so much better than other companies, and I would imagine other companies wanted to follow that model. What was Enron doing right? And I'm sure that maybe some people probably looked at you like, what's wrong with you?
Stephanie,
You're a hugely successful company.
That's a really good question and comment you just made, because when I left, everybody in the industry who knew me, the institutional community, was wondering why I left the greatest company in the world, which other companies were trying to replicate and emulate the Enron business model. I said I had my reasons, and I just wanted to move on with my career. So at the point in time I left, the Enron stock was on a trajectory going up. Well, now we know that there were certain reasons for that trajectory that were not altogether true earnings and true revenues. Fraud. They were being manufactured. They were being managed. So the market didn't know that. The footnotes in every financial statement were illegible. You couldn't read them. You couldn't understand them. Nobody could understand it. If you didn't understand the footnotes in the financial statements, investors tended to stay away from the stock.
How could you explain what happened to the layperson and or somebody who maybe wasn't around or wasn't paying attention when this happened? This was huge when this happened, but it was 20 years ago, and people have short memories.
Right. Well, it's a 21-year-old story, but the lessons in life are timeless. You think about it: fraud, deceit, illegal activities, in my opinion, that were borne out with indictments and ultimate convictions. Mm-hmm. How could people see it coming? Most people couldn't. Probably no one saw it coming. I didn't see the bankruptcy coming. When I anonymously reached out to the Wall Street Journal, I had no idea they could go into bankruptcy.
Why did you?
Why did I do that? I quit because I felt like the activities that were being conducted by a senior group of officers at Enron were potentially illegal. They were fraudulent. They were self-dealing, self-serving. I didn't agree with the corporate governance. I didn't agree with the ultimate structure that was against what I had proposed. So I quit. Now, why did I reach out to the Wall Street Journal? 18 months later, Jeff Skilling quit. He didn't quit because he wanted to retire. He quit because he saw the train wreck coming. He quit August 14th, I believe, 2001. He saw the train wreck coming. I reached out to the Wall Street Journal in September and October of 2001, anonymously, because I felt like at the time, with all the bad press around Enron, there was no mention of all the private market transactions that the CFO and other senior officers were involved in. And I felt that material had to be in the public domain. How could I get it there? Well, one day I saw a little one-paragraph article in the Wall Street Journal about CFO of Enron has a private equity fund, and that's when I reached out to the Wall Street Journal. And it was surgical, it was to the point. They asked if I called them, I said, what do you know about this partnership? And they said, we don't know anything except what we've heard on the street. Do you know anything? And I said, well, I was actually the architect of these partnerships and these original structures, but they didn't follow my advice. And my advice was to pull the management team out of Enron once the fund is raised, so you don't bring in these related party issues, self-dealing, accusations, and that kind of thing. And they said, do you have any information about it? And I said, what do you want? I have everything. I've got the limited partnership agreement. I've got the private placement agreement. I know how everything was set up.
Why, did you do this to warn people?
I did it to put it in the public market and hold those accountable who needed to be held accountable. My fear was that it would be buried in a merger with another company, or they could limp along. And in my opinion, this information needed to be in the public market for public dissemination. Let the public decide whether it was deceit and self-dealing.
I think a lot of people, when you hear, you're talking billions and billions and billions of dollars. When you came forward with this information that could, essentially blow their cover, were you afraid? Was any part of you afraid for your own safety that something would happen to you?
It was. For the first couple of years, when the first articles came out in the journal, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, these guys are the best writers, the best authors, the best reporters, the Wall Street Journal folks, John M. Schweiler and Rebecca Smith. I spent a lot of time with them on the phone, walking them through the various structures, the very complicated ways these things were set up. And when the first article hit, it was catastrophic. It was front page. He called me the day before, John M. Schweiler did, and said, this is front page, we got front page status tomorrow. And I was like, just do it, just do it. I wished I'd coined that phrase before Nike, but I said that's why I called you, just put it out there. After about and then that afternoon, I'm coming around to your question, but that afternoon, Ken Lay issued a press release. We support the CFO, he's additive, he's this, he's that. And I was kind of like, you just wait, there's so much more that's coming out. So after about the 4th article, CFO was fired and they started cleaning house, but it was probably too late at that point. Was I concerned about my safety? I was for a while, because I was like, at one point, oh my gosh, what have I done? But I just felt it had to be in the public market. And at that point, I was so glad that I had told the Wall Street Journal that I had to remain anonymous, because they were powerful people at the time, and I just wanted to protect myself and my family. But it was, the information I provided was catastrophic. And when I first reached out to the Wall Street Journal, our first conversation, she kept asking me, Rebecca Smith kept asking me what my name was. And I said, I'm not going to tell you. And then I finally said, I'll tell you my name, I'll tell you my involvement, but I have to remain anonymous. And they said, okay, we'll keep you anonymous. How can I be sure? We're the Wall Street Journal, that's how we get our information. And I said, I'll honor that. And they kept that for 20 years. And they were getting calls for the first 10 years, who talked to you, the Wall Street Journal? And people would call them, who talked to you, who talked to you? They never gave me up. And I didn't either, until they decided a year and a half ago to do this podcast. And they called me, John called me and he said, you remember me? And I said, oh, John, do I ever? Oh boy, we spent a lot of time together. He said they're going to do a 20-year podcast, and they wanted to finally name me as the person who led them into the CFO's office.
Was it liberating in a way?
It was. You have no
Why?
idea.
Did you, in a way, did you want the people, I mean, these are people that you told that you knew what was going on before you quit. Was there sort of just a satisfaction in that?
It lifted a lot of burden off me that I lived with for 20 years. Every time I thought of Enron, I thought, whatever small part I had in its demise, and I didn't realize they were going into bankruptcy, but I felt so bad about everybody that lost so much. And for that reason, most of all, I didn't want to profit. I didn't want to come out and say I was the original whistleblower to the Wall Street Journal. I just wanted to move on with my career.
You didn't write a book?
I think we already know the ending, don't we? Maybe, I don't know. We know the ending. So it's changed my life in a way, because I felt like there were various chapters in my Enron career, leaving Enron, and I thought, boy, this is finally over. Then 18 months later, I've got to do something. This company is in disarray. There's so much bad press, but none of it deals with these private market transactions, which were so, in my opinion, instrumental to Enron's financial issues. And I felt just compelled to put that information out in the public market. Then I felt like, you know what? I've done my job putting out in the public market. Then actually in January, right after they went into bankruptcy, I reached out to the SEC, and I had a meeting with the SEC, FBI, and U.S. Attorney's Office one day, and told them my whole story, connected some dots for them, but it's very clear they were very far along in their investigation, which had started because of the Wall Street Journal articles, which started because of the information I gave them. Now, then several years later, Kurt Eichenwald wrote Conspiracy of Fools. Very, very, very good book, well written. He called me when he had his final draft, and he said, I've reread 220 interviews, and I've got one question I can't answer, although I think I know the answer. And I said, oh yeah, Kurt, what's that? And he said, who talked to the Wall Street Journal that started this mess? And he said, I've got one name. And I said, who? Who you think? He said, you. And I said, you know, Kurt, you're right. I talked to him. I talked to him a lot, and I walked him through everything. So yes, the first 6 or 8 articles were the information I provided, and I stayed anonymous. Can I put you in my book? I said, no, you can't put me in your book. I want to stay anonymous. So then I thought, gosh, my life at Enron is done now. And that was in 2004 or 5. A year and a half ago, I get a call from old friend John Emschweiler. They're doing a podcast at the Wall Street Journal. wanted to finally name me, and he said the producers want to build this whole podcast around the original whistleblower, who was me. So I ultimately agreed to let them name me and set the record straight finally. This is probably the last chapter of having speeches, scheduling speeches to college business classes and investment clubs and that kind of thing about business ethics, telling my story 20 years later. Although it's a 20-year-old story, has some applications to everyday life.
Twice since you've sat down, when you bring up how people were affected, you get choked up. When people talk about markets, investments, they think about numbers on a computer screen. You don't realize the lives that are affected, pensions, shareholders who, billions and billions of dollars. You think people's livelihoods.
Total net worth. People were wiped out. And I was incensed and I was mad. I lost a little bit of money because I had my 401k at Enron and Enron stock and options, and I drank the Kool-Aid for a while, and at some point I was like, well, let's just see how far this goes down. But my losses were small compared to these folks at Portland General or some other utility or some other company that Enron had acquired, and they had their life savings in their retirement funds, and it was all in Enron stock. And people lost hundreds of millions of dollars, and it was, I felt so bad about that, and that's why I didn't want to profit from it. That's why I just wanted to make sure those guys were held accountable who, in my opinion, again, created a big part of the mess.
Now I have to ask you, because so many things, sometimes you see things sort of in a vacuum and you just kind of isolate them, but not too long after this scandal, you had the crash of 2008, right? From your point of view, there was also fraud with the housing market crash and things like that. Did part of you see that happening too, or did you think, we still haven't learned our lessons?
No, I think first of all, I'm not an economist, and I'm not smart enough to understand when recessions are going to occur. I think 2008 was a very different series of events in the economy than Enron. And then remember, I believe WorldCom followed Enron with massive fraud at the senior officer level. But I think that it was just a point in time when a company had run its course and did all they could to hide, frankly, non-performing assets on their balance sheet. And so they had to look for different ways to do it. And at some point, the music stops. You can't keep doing that forever.
Yeah, I just say that because of 2000, we did discover there was a lot of fraud.
Absolutely.
There was a lot of fraud and toxic assets.
And the mortgage-backed asset market completely cratered, and that brought the economy down in part. So I wasn't, frankly, when I reached out to the Wall Street Journal, I had no idea it would have the effect on Enron stock. And after the first 3 or 4 articles, the stock traded down from like 33 to 13. And it bounced a little bit on the Dynegy merger proposal, and then that just went down and into bankruptcy in December. I had no idea that the material I gave the Wall Street Journal would be a part of Enron's demise, and it turns out, in retrospect, it might have been a pretty significant part. I think the public markets lost all confidence in Enron, without question.
Sure.
Private markets did too, and no one wanted to touch the stock. It was toxic. There was fraud at the senior officer level. So how in the world can you have confidence in management in a company when you see all that happening?
I want to go back to something you mentioned when I asked you whether you were afraid. Was there any part of you that regretted doing this? That regretted coming forward? Because it's a mixed bag.
It's a mixed bag. I had no regrets. I've been asked so many times, would I do it again? And I said, I would do it again. Would I do it the same way? Absolutely. I would remain anonymous. But, at some point, if something's wrong, you have to say something to somebody. And I bided my time for 1.5 years. Remember, when I left in early 2000, Enron stock, as we've talked about, was on a trajectory going up. No one would have believed me if I had gone public and said there's massive fraud at the senior officer level in this company. So I never thought at that point that I would reach out to the Wall Street Journal. I just went on with my career and thought, let those guys play unchaperoned in the playground. It's going to be a train wreck. I don't know when, but something's going to happen. It's a treadmill, and it gets faster and faster, and at some point you got to jump off the treadmill. So a year and a half later, when Jeff Skilling quit, there was a lot of bad press around Enron, and I thought now's the time. When the Wall Street Journal had that one paragraph article that we've talked about, I thought now's the time to surgically put this into the market and let them decide how they want to write the articles. Again, they wrote fantastic, very piercing articles of wrongdoing at Enron.
How many lectures have you given to business school students?
It's so funny, this came out in October, and I have not advertised it, but I've had some inbound calls, and now I'm getting more and more from West Coast universities, Texas universities, investment clubs, and it's a story that needs to be told, I think.
What do you want them to glean from your experience? What is the lesson?
Integrity.
Do you think that gets lost a lot in the business world when you're talking about so much money?
It's easy to get lost. It's easy to get lost. I remember a quote former U.S. Senator Alan Simpson made one time. If you have integrity,
like it is.
Exactly. If you have integrity, nothing else matters. If you don't have integrity, nothing else matters. And I felt like a certain small portion or certain small group of senior officers at Enron really lost their way. Did they lose integrity? Did they lose ethics? Did they lose honesty? Well, if they ever had them, they were misplaced for some period of time and created such financial problems that they couldn't solve at some point. The treadmill was going too fast, they couldn't solve. So now, why did I reach out to the Wall Street Journal? We've already talked about that. But I remember another quote from a German Lutheran minister in pre-war Nazi Germany, Dietrich Bonhoeffer: not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. If I hadn't spoken and I hadn't acted, then I would have been condoning the very activities for which I quit Enron. And it's very important for me to speak and to act.
Is there a spiritual component to this?
Do the right thing. I could have made the wrong decision and gone to jail. And yes, there is. I think we've all made wrong decisions in our lives, of course. I'm not being philosophical, but we've all made decisions we regret. That's one decision I don't regret. And I think there was divine intervention in me reading the Wall Street Journal that one day. Look, I never read the Wall Street Journal because I can never find the comic section, okay? But for one reason, I think divine intervention, that one day I read the journal cover to cover, and I saw that article on page 2, heard on the street, and that started everything.
Final question. So I already asked you about what advice you would give to business school students or people looking to go into finance or anything, but how about for the little guy, the lay person?
Oh boy. Trust your.
It's a lot more loaded.
Boy, it's a hard question. Trust your instincts, not what you're told. At Enron, in October of 2001, the CEO told every employee to load up on Enron stock. He knew, in my opinion, that they were suffering from severe financial distress and probably going into bankruptcy. And yet he told everybody to load up on Enron stock. And at that point, I remember reading that and thinking, how can a CEO tell employees to buy the stock when it's gone from 93 to 30? And he said, this is at the bottom, now we're going back up. And that was, trust your instincts to the everyday person. Don't listen to what you're told by senior management because it may or may not be true. I drank the Kool-Aid for a while, and then I needed to leave because the activities were short of ethics, they were short of honesty, they were short of integrity, and I saw it firsthand, and I did not want to be a part of it. The interesting story, 21 years later.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.